In the winter of 1871, a woman named Mary Ann Gaskin rose before 4 in the morning, wrapped her infant in a strip of sacking, laid it at the edge of a frozen clay field, and went to work molding bricks. She would mold 5,000 of them before the light failed. She would be paid enough to buy a loaf of bread, a little cheese, and the privilege of doing it all again tomorrow. She wasn't unusual. Across the brick fields of Britain, across the kiln yards of colonial India, across the clay pits of ancient Mesopotamia and the building sites of imperial Rome, tens of millions of people just like Mary Ann spent their entire lives in the business of making bricks. They were not famous. They were not remembered. But without them, without their hands, their lungs full of clay dust, their backs bent over wooden molds from childhood, none of what we call civilization would have existed. Not a temple, not a sewer, not a railway viaduct, not a terraced house on a London street. But here's the part that still puzzles historians and industrial economists who've studied the records. In the great brick-making regions of Victorian England and colonial South Asia, workers were paid per 1,000 bricks completed. The more you made, the more you earned. Simple enough. And yet, year after year, the documentary record shows the same pattern. Workers arrived at the season's start, received an advance on their wages to pay for food and lodging, and by season's end, they owed more to the contractor than they had earned. They were, in theory, free laborers. In practice, they could not leave. They had effectively become bonded to a debt that, by design, they could never repay. How does one of the oldest trades in human history, a trade practiced for over 10,000 years across every civilization on Earth, consistently end up enslaving the very hands that perform it? We'll get there. But first, we need to understand how it all began. Before we settle in, if you find value in what we make here, a like or a subscribe does genuinely help us keep doing this work. And if you've ever worked in construction, in brickwork, or in any of the building trades, or if your parents or grandparents did, I'd be particularly glad to hear your memories in the comments. Those are the stories that don't make it into the textbooks. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Find yourself a comfortable spot, and let's ease into this one together. Chapter 2, 10,000 Years of Mud, Where Bricks Began. The brick is older than writing. It is older than the wheel. It predates bronze. It predates the plow. And it almost certainly predates the concept of civilization as we use that word. When archaeologists excavated the ancient city of Jericho, yes, that Jericho, the one with the famous walls, they found mud bricks dating to roughly 9,000 years before the Common Era. 9,000. Let that settle. While most of the world's population was still entirely nomadic, still following game herds and sleeping in seasonal shelters, the people of Jericho were pressing clay into rectangular forms, drying them in the desert sun, and stacking them into walls that were meant to last, and in some cases they did. The earliest bricks were not what we would recognize as bricks at all. They were closer to large clay loaves, hand-shaped, irregular, often humped or curved on top because the makers were simply pressing clay against their thigh or against a shallow depression in the ground. Archaeologists call these plano-convex bricks, flat on the bottom, rounded on top, and they appear in sites across the ancient Near East, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, at remarkably similar dates, as if the idea was spreading along trade routes or simply occurring to people independently, because wet clay is wet clay, and human hands have not fundamentally changed in 10,000 years. What made bricks revolutionary, and this is worth pausing to appreciate, was not simply the material. Clay was everywhere in the ancient Near East. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposited it in vast quantities across the floodplain of Mesopotamia, leaving behind soil so rich in clay that you could, quite literally, scoop up the ground and start building. What made the brick revolutionary was the idea of standardization. At some point, someone realized that if you made all your bricks the same size, a wall could be built faster, by more than one person, with far less individual decision-making. A standard brick meant you could hand someone a stack of them and they'd know exactly what to do. It was, in its quiet way, one of the first industrial insights in human history. The Indus Valley civilization took this insight and ran with it in a way that still astonishes engineers today. And here's something that stops archaeologists in their tracks. Beneath the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, those same standardized fired bricks were used to build covered drainage channels, not open sewers. Covered, corbelled brick tunnels running beneath the entire city, connected to covered brick inspection chambers, wide enough for a person to enter for maintenance. The ancient world's first urban sewage system, running for decades, probably centuries, beneath a city of perhaps 40,000 people. Built by brick workers whose names we will never know, whose wages, if any, are entirely unrecorded, and whose contribution to the history of public health has been effectively invisible for 4,000 years. Those who remember working on post-war construction crews, rebuilding cities across Britain and Europe after the Blitz, will appreciate what it meant to work with standardized components under pressure. The principle hasn't changed. You can build quickly, build well, and build at scale only if every brick in the stack is the same as the last one. The people of Mohenjo-Daro understood this completely. We'll come back to the question of labor, to what it actually cost the human beings who made these bricks later in tonight's story. But before we get there, we need to understand one more thing about where the brick came from, because the story of its invention is not simple, and it does not belong to a single civilization. That's one of the things that makes this trade so remarkable. The brick was not exported from one culture to another like a patent. It was discovered independently, again and again, by people working with the same material, wet clay, in environments that demanded permanent shelter, water management, and the ability to build quickly at scale. Brickmaking is, in some sense, the human response to the problem of permanence. How do you make something that lasts when your only available building material is mud? In ancient Mesopotamia, in the great city-states of Sumer that arose in what is now southern Iraq around 3,000 years before the Common Era, brickmaking was not merely a trade. It was a civic obligation, a religious act, and in some periods a matter of law. The great ziggurats of and Uruk, those enormous stepped temple platforms that rose above the flat floodplain like man-made mountains, consumed bricks in staggering quantities. Archaeologists estimate the great ziggurat of required somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 million bricks for its final construction. 4 million. And those were not small bricks. The workers who built those ziggurats were not volunteers inspired by civic pride. Some were slaves. Some were corvée laborers, citizens required by law to contribute a fixed number of days' work per year to state construction projects, a kind of physical taxation. Some were temple dependents, men and women whose labor was managed by the temple bureaucracy in exchange for rations of grain, oil, and cloth. The records are remarkably detailed on this point, because the Sumerians were among the first people in history to write things down, and what they chose to write down among their poetry and their mythology were administrative records, ration lists, work quotas, brick counts. We know from clay tablets found at Lagash and Nippur that a standard adult male ration worker was expected to produce somewhere between 300 and 600 bricks per day, depending on the period. We know they were issued daily rations of barley beer and bread. We know that workers who fell short of their quota had their rations reduced. We know there were overseers. And we know because the tablets tell us that sometimes workers ran away. Which tells you something about the working conditions that no ration list ever will. And this is where tonight's central question begins to take shape. The question we posed at the beginning. Because what the Sumerian records reveal, and what the British industrial records reveal 4,000 years later, and what the colonial South Asian records reveal in the 19th century, is a pattern so consistent across so many cultures and so many centuries that it stops being coincidence. Everywhere the brick trade operated at scale, the workers were constrained. Not always by chains, not always by law, but by debt, by quota, by their physical inability to go elsewhere and survive. The men and women who built civilization with their hands rarely owned a piece of it. That question, the one about debt and bondage and why it kept reappearing, we'll return to it. We're getting closer. But first, we need to spend some time with the actual work. Because before you can understand the economics of brickmaking, you need to understand what it actually costs a human body to do it. Chapter 3. The work itself. What brickmaking does to a human body. The work began with the clay. Always with the clay. And if you have never worked with raw clay, not the pleasant studio pottery variety, clean and wedged and ready for the wheel, but raw industrial clay pulled straight from a pit full of stones and roots and the compressed debris of centuries, then the first thing to understand is the weight of it. A cubic foot of wet clay weighs approximately 130 pounds. The pit where your raw material lives might be 10, 15, 30 feet deep. Getting it out, getting it to the working area, and getting it into a condition suitable for molding required effort that began before the sun was fully up and did not stop until the light failed. The clay getter was a specialist, recognized as such even in the harsh hierarchy of the brick yard. His job was to excavate the raw clay from the pit face, to read the strata, the different layers of clay, gravel, and chalk, and to mix them in the proportions that would produce workable material. Too much chalk in the mix, and your bricks would crack in the kiln. Too much sand, and they'd crumble under load. The clay getter knew this not from any textbook, but from years of watching what happened to bricks made from clay. He'd misjudged, and from the contractor's boot applied to his earnings when the product failed. It was, in its way, a form of applied geology practiced by men with no formal education and no job security whatsoever. Once the clay had been excavated, it needed to be prepared, mixed with the correct proportions of sand or ash, worked to eliminate air pockets, and brought to a consistency that a molder's hands could work quickly. In larger brickworks by the mid-19th century, this was done by a pug mill, a cylindrical drum fitted with rotating iron blades, driven by a horse walking in circles at the end of a long horizontal beam, blindfolded so it wouldn't get dizzy. The horse walked those circles all day. Every day. Historians of the period note that brickyard horses tended to die young and were not generally mourned at length by their owners. The workers who led them, often children of 8 or 9, fared somewhat better. Not dramatically better, but somewhat. Now here is where we need to talk about the molder. Because the molder was the central figure of the entire operation. The person whose skill, speed, and endurance determined how many bricks got made in a day, and therefore whether anyone got paid. The molding process at its core was simple. You took a lump of clay roughly the right size for a brick. Experience told you the size, no weighing involved. You threw it hard into a rectangular iron or wooden frame called a mold. You pressed it down firmly with your palms to fill the corners. You scraped the surplus off the top with a strike, and then you turned the mold over onto a wooden pallet and lifted it away, leaving a perfectly formed wet green brick to begin its slow journey toward the kiln. Start to finish. On a good day, this took a skilled molder approximately 30 seconds per brick. 30 seconds. That sounds manageable, perhaps even pleasant. Here is the mathematics of what that actually means over a working day. A moulder working at the standard productive rate in Victorian Britain, the rate on which their piecework wages were calculated, was expected to produce between 3,000 and 5,000 bricks per day. At 5,000 bricks, that is 1 brick every 6 seconds for 10 continuous hours. No pauses for comfort, no pauses for thought. Every 6 seconds, a fresh lump of clay thrown, pressed, struck, turned, stripped, and moved on. The motion required stooping forward at the striking board, lifting a clay lump of approximately 7 pounds with both hands, twisting it into the mold, pressing down with the full weight of both palms, striking, twisting, lifting the mold, stooping, lifting, twisting, pressing, striking, twisting, lifting, for 10 hours, at 5,000 repetitions. by any modern ergonomic standard, and ergonomics did not exist as a science until the 20th century. This would be classified as extreme repetitive strain combined with continuous load-bearing in a non-neutral spinal position. In plain language, it destroyed backs, shoulders, wrists, and hips with a methodical efficiency that age only amplified. There are records from brickworks, medical inspections in the 1860s and 70s, rare documents, because nobody was terribly interested in recording the health of brickworkers, showing that experienced molders over the age of 40 frequently presented with spinal curvature, chronic wrist inflammation, and what contemporary physicians called molder's hand, a condition of severe thickening and partial contracture of the fingers and palm from years of forceful gripping. Modern medicine would recognize it immediately as severe Dupuytren's contracture, combined with carpal tunnel syndrome. The physicians of the period noted it as an interesting occupational curiosity. The workers with the condition noted it as a reason they could no longer hold a cup properly, and that their ability to earn was beginning to fail them. And here is the part that requires a moment of honest reckoning. The molder was not the lowest person in the brickyard hierarchy. Not by some distance. That role belonged to the hack girl. The hack girl, and the term was used unself-consciously in the Victorian brick industry records, was the worker responsible for carrying freshly molded green bricks from the molder's striking board to the drying ground, laying them out in rows and later collecting them for the kiln. She was, in practice, a human conveyor system. The word girl is not inaccurate. In most mid-19th century brickworks, this job was performed predominantly by females, many of them children between the ages of 7 and 12, though women of all ages worked the role as well. They worked barefoot on the clay yard, because shoes were expensive, and clay consumed them rapidly. They worked in all weathers, because the molder's production did not pause for rain. The weight carried by a hack girl across a 10-hour day is difficult to calculate with precision, but historians of labor who have attempted the arithmetic arrive at similar conclusions. A productive molder turning out 4,000 bricks required the hack girl, or girls if he was fast enough to need more than one, to carry something in the range of 12 to 15 tons of green brick over the course of the day. Not all at once, of course. In loads of 4 bricks per trip, across a drying ground that might be 60 to 80 yards from the striking board. Back and forth, 4 bricks each way, all day barefoot, in the rain when it rained, and in the heat when it was hot. The parliamentary inquiries of the 1870s, which did eventually investigate conditions in the brick fields, collected testimony from women who had started hack work at the age of 7 and were still doing it at 50 if their bodies permitted. One woman, giving evidence to the Children's Employment Commission, described starting work before 5 in the morning and finishing after 7 in the evening. She was asked if she found the work hard. Her recorded response was, and I am quoting the parliamentary record here, "It's always been hard. You get used to it or you don't." There is a lifetime of unwritten history in that sentence. We ought to hold that image for a moment before moving on. A woman in her 40s, in her Sunday dress, explaining her childhood labor to a group of men who had almost certainly never visited a brick field in their lives, and who were somewhat surprised to learn the details of what they were about to put into a report that would take another decade to produce any change in the law. The mills of parliamentary reform, as we know, ground exceedingly slow. Those who remember the early labor movement, who remember when decent working conditions were something you organized and fought for rather than something you simply received, will recognize this dynamic. The gap between the people who knew what the work cost and the people who had the power to change it has always been wide, and has always been crossed only with enormous effort. If you or your family had any part in those fights, in the unions, in the organizing, in the legislation, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Chapter 4. Children of the Kiln. Child labor in the brick fields. The brick industry's use of child labor was not a secret in the Victorian era. It was not a dark rumor whispered between reformers in drawing rooms. It was documented, discussed, debated in Parliament for 40 years, and largely left to continue, because the economic interests it served were substantial, well-organized, and deeply resistant to interruption. By the 1860s, children as young as 5 were documented working in brick yards across Bedfordshire, Staffordshire, and the West Midlands, a region that was at that moment producing the majority of the bricks being used to build Britain's railways, its sewers, its terraced housing, and its public buildings. The children's work in the brickyard was diverse in its forms and consistent in its misery. The youngest worked as temperers, mixing clay and water with their feet in shallow pits, cold in the morning, baking hot by afternoon. Slightly older children turned bricks on the drying ground, moving down the rows one by one and rotating each brick to ensure it dried evenly on all sides, a process that had to be repeated several times over 2 to 3 days. The faster children worked as hack girls and hack boys alongside their mothers and older sisters. The most capable teenagers, and in this context, capable means physically enduring, worked the kiln fires. Kiln firing was a continuous process that ran through the day and night because you could not stop a kiln once it reached temperature without losing the entire batch. The internal temperature required to properly fire a standard clay brick, transforming it from a fragile green form into a hard, durable masonry unit, is somewhere between 900 and 1100 degrees Celsius. Maintaining that temperature required constant attention and constant fuel feed. In the large downdraft kilns of the mid-Victorian period, this meant the stokehole workers rotated in shifts of roughly 4 hours, feeding coal slack through the low arched openings at the base of the kiln, while the heat, even at the outside of the opening, was intense enough to redden exposed skin within minutes. The parliamentary testimony of one kiln boy, taken in 1867 and preserved in the report of the Children's Employment Commission, described his shift as beginning at 10 in the evening and ending at 2 in the morning, at which point he would sleep briefly on a pile of sacking near the kiln, because it was warm before beginning the next day's work. He was 11 years old. His name was recorded as Thomas. His surname the commissioners apparently did not trouble to write down. The person who managed all of this was the contractor, sometimes called the subcontractor or gangmaster, depending on the period and region. And this figure is central to understanding how the economics of the brick trade actually worked, because the contractor occupied a peculiar position in the industrial hierarchy, technically independent, in practice a piece of mechanism in a much larger system, extracting labor from workers beneath him while being squeezed by the brickmaster above him. The brickmaster, the owner of the works, typically did not employ workers directly. He contracted out the production of bricks by the thousand to a contractor who then assembled, paid, housed, and fed a gang of workers from that per thousand payment. The contractor's profit was the difference between what the brickmaster paid him and what it actually cost to keep the workers alive and producing. This arrangement had several advantages for the brickmaster. It shifted the legal and moral responsibility for worker welfare onto the contractor. It created a competitive market among contractors that kept the per thousand rate low, and it meant the brickmaster never had to look a child in the face and explain why 11-year-old Thomas was sleeping on sacking by a kiln at 2 in the morning. Here is where we return, briefly, to that central question from the beginning. Because the contractor's lodging system, in which workers who had travelled to the brick fields lived in housing provided by the contractor, ate food supplied through the contractor's accounts, and received their wages at the end of the season minus the accumulated charges for housing, food, and the initial advance they'd needed to travel there in the first place. This system has a name in economic history. It is called tide labour, or in its most formal variation, debt bondage. And it was not unique to Victorian Britain. We'll come to the full answer to that question shortly. The question of why a free trade consistently produced unfree workers. But before we get there, we need to follow the brick beyond the moulding yard and into the kiln itself, because what happened inside those extraordinary structures is a story that deserves its own chapter, and it connects, in ways that will become clear, to why the work had to be so relentless. Chapter 5. Inside the Kiln, Fire, Science, and the Workers Who Tended Both. The Hoffman Kiln. And if you know anything about Victorian industrial architecture, you know the name, was one of the most elegant solutions to a continuous production problem that the 19th century ever devised. Friedrich Hoffmann, a German engineer, patented it in 1858, and by the 1870s it had spread to every major brick-producing region in Britain, Europe, and the colonial world. The principle was deceptively simple. Instead of building and cooling a kiln for each batch, you built a ring-shaped tunnel kiln with a series of chambers, and you moved the fire continuously around the ring, preheating the next batch with the exhaust from the current one, cooling the previous batch with the incoming cold air. The fire never stopped. The production never stopped, and the workers never stopped. The Hoffmann kiln consumed roughly 1 ton of coal for every 10,000 bricks it fired, which sounds efficient until you consider that a single large works might fire 30 million bricks in a season, and that the coal had to be delivered by the barge load, stored in the yard, and carried by hand to each of the stoke holes at the rate the fire demanded. The workers who did this, stokers, drawers, and setters, occupied the most physically brutal positions in the entire production chain, the positions closest to the actual fire, and were paid accordingly. Which is to say, they were paid slightly more than the molders, which is to say, they were still poor. The setter was the specialist who loaded the kiln. Loading a kiln was not simply stacking bricks. It required an intimate understanding of how heat moved through the chamber, which zones ran hot, which ran cool, where the draft created uneven conditions, and the ability to arrange bricks in a pattern that allowed sufficient air circulation for even firing while maximizing the number of bricks in each batch. A well-set kiln produced bricks of consistent hardness and color throughout. A poorly set kiln produced a catastrophic variation. Over-fired bricks fused into useless clinker at the hot spots, under-fired bricks still soft and crumbling at the cool ones. In either case, the financial loss fell on the contractor's account, and through the contractor on the worker's wages. Drawing, unloading the fired bricks from the kiln, was done while the chamber was still dangerously hot, because waiting for it to cool fully would break the continuous production cycle of the Hoffmann system. The drawers wore heavy leather gloves and worked in a chamber where the internal temperature at the time of opening might still be several hundred degrees, the bricks too hot to touch with bare skin for more than a second. They worked in shifts and emerged periodically into the yard, dripping sweat onto the clay, to drink water and breathe air that was, by comparison with the kiln interior, practically refreshing. The heat over a full working season, accumulated in the tissues of a drawer's hands and face, produced a particular kind of premature aging that brickyard physicians noted and factory inspectors occasionally photographed. Men of 45 who had drawn kilns for 20 years looked, by contemporary accounts, as if they were 65. Their skin was permanently reddened and coarsened. Their eyes, perpetually strained in smoky, heat-shimmering conditions, often showed early signs of the cataracts we now associate with prolonged infrared radiation exposure. They were, in the most literal sense, being slowly cooked, and they knew it. And they continued, because there was nothing else. The fireman occupied a peculiar position in this hierarchy, respected for his skill, distrusted for his independence. A good fireman could tell the temperature of a kiln by the color of the smoke, the sound of the draw, and a kind of temperature sense developed through years of proximity to fire. He adjusted the dampers, controlled the air supply, decided when each section of the Hoffmann ring had reached sufficient temperature to progress the fire to the next chamber. Get it wrong, and you lost a batch. Get it consistently right, and you were, in the brickmaster's vocabulary, a valuable asset. This was one of the very few roles in the brickyard where individual skill created genuine bargaining power. A fireman who knew his kilns could occasionally negotiate better terms than other workers, because replacing him mid-season was risky. He was not treated well, exactly, but he was treated with a degree of calculation that constituted, in this context, something close to respect. The finished bricks still had to be graded, sorted by quality into categories that would determine their price and use. First quality bricks, perfectly fired and uniform, went to facing work, the visible outer skin of buildings where appearance mattered. Second quality went to interior construction. Third quality, the overfired clinker and the underfired softies, went to rubble fill, road base, and other applications where structural elegance was not the primary requirement. The grading was traditionally done by women, and it was skilled work of a particular kind, the kind that goes unrecognized because it does not involve visible physical power. A good brick grader could sort 1,000 bricks an hour by the sound they made when tapped. A clear ringing tone for a well-fired hard brick, a dull thud for an underfired soft one, while simultaneously assessing the brick's surface for cracking, warping, and discoloration. She received less than the male workers in every documented brickyard in Victorian Britain. This was explained, when it was explained at all, by reference to the greater physical demands of moulding and kiln work. It was not explained by any honest assessment of the skill involved, because that conversation was not considered worth having. The brick's journey did not end at the yard. Once loaded onto the canal barge, a process that itself required considerable physical labor, since a fully loaded narrowboat might carry 20,000 bricks, it traveled the extraordinary network of English canals to building sites across the country. The canals had been built, it bears noting, largely from the same bricks that would now travel on them. There was a pleasing circularity to this that the workers carrying the bricks would probably have found less pleasing than historians do. By the time a brick reached its final destination, the wall of a railway viaduct, a row of terraced houses in a northern mill town, a London sewer tunnel, it had passed through perhaps a dozen pairs of hands. The clay getter, the pug mill horse and its driver, the moulder, the hack girl, the turner, the kiln setter, the stoker, the fireman, the drawer, the grader, the loader, the bargeman. Of these 12, roughly 2, the contractor, and on a good season, a highly productive moulder, had any real prospect of saving money. The rest were, in the economic language of the period, barely self-sustaining. And that brings us to the question we have been circling since the beginning of tonight's story, because now we have enough context to understand the answer properly. Chapter 6, The Debt Trap. How free labor became bound labor. The system worked as follows, and it is worth following the mathematics carefully, because the mathematics is exactly where the trap was built. At the start of the brick season, typically April when the ground had dried enough to work, a contractor would engage a gang of workers, often from the agricultural districts where winter had left people without income. The workers frequently had no money to travel to the brick fields. The contractor therefore advanced them the cost of travel, perhaps 2 or 3 shillings per person. He also provided their lodging a room in a building he owned or leased, at a rate he set unilaterally. He provided food through a truck shop or a contractor's cook, again at prices he set. He provided the tools, molds, pallets, pug mill use at a weekly hire charge. Everything the worker consumed, travel, lodging, food, tool hire, was recorded in the contractor's ledger as a debt against future wages. The wages themselves were paid by the piece, so many shillings per 1,000 bricks completed and accepted as first or second quality. At the end of the season, the contractor would settle accounts. Total bricks produced, multiplied by the rate, minus all accumulated deductions. Here is where the mechanism reveals itself with brutal precision. The piece rate was set by the contractor before the season began, based on what the brick master was paying him per 1,000. The deductions were set by the contractor throughout the season, based on whatever the contractor chose to charge. If the brickmaster reduced his rate mid-season, which happened particularly in years of low demand, the contractor absorbed some of that reduction and passed the rest down to the workers in the form of quietly increased deduction charges. The truck shop prices rose. The lodging charge rose. The tool hire rose. The worker, who had no access to any shop but the contractor's, and no housing but the contractor's, and no transport home that he could afford, had no mechanism to resist any of this. At the end of a full season, 5 or 6 months of work at the pace described in the previous chapter, a productive moulder might find himself with a positive balance of a few shillings. A less productive worker, or one whose bricks had been rejected at higher rates, or one whose family had required more from the truck shop, often found himself with a negative balance. He owed the contractor money. He had no savings with which to repay it. He could not legally leave without settling the debt, and so he signed on for the next season, beginning the cycle again with last season's debt already entered in the ledger, an opening deduction before a single brick had been molded. This was not hidden. It was not particularly unusual. It was, in many regions of Victorian Britain, simply how the brick trade worked, how it had worked for decades, and how it would continue to work with modest variation until parliamentary legislation and trade union organizing eventually forced change. The Truck Acts, which were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of payment-in-kind wage manipulation, were routinely circumvented by contractors who understood the law more precisely than the workers they employed. The workers, for their part, understood the trap. The evidence of that is in the parliamentary testimony, in the labor organizing records, and in the simple documented fact of periodic, desperate attempts to run. The records of several large Bedfordshire brickworks contain what are called absconder lists, names of workers who left before their seasonal debt was settled, typically in the night, occasionally in groups. The legal mechanisms available to contractors to recover absconded workers were, in theory, substantial. Under certain interpretations of the Master and Servant Acts, leaving before the completion of a contracted season was a criminal offence punishable by imprisonment. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. A contractor in a prosperous season might not bother pursuing a single absconding worker. In a poor season, with accounts badly in arrears, he might pursue several, and magistrates, who were often themselves landowners or businessmen with an interest in maintaining labor discipline, might well oblige with arrest warrants. The reformer George Smith of Colville, who spent 20 years documenting and agitating against conditions in the Midlands brick fields and published his findings in a book called The Crying Evils of Our Day in 1870, described families that had been bound to a single contractor for 3 successive generations, grandparents, parents, and children all carrying forward a debt that never reached zero. Not because anyone had designed this as a hereditary system, but because the arithmetic ensured it. The debt was structural. It was built into the rates and the charges and the physical isolation of the seasonal worker's situation, and it reproduced itself automatically, generation after generation, without requiring any conscious cruelty from the contractor. He simply did the accounting. Reformers like George Smith occupy an interesting position in this story, which is to say, they are not entirely sympathetic figures either. Smith was genuinely moved by what he saw in the brick fields. He documented it carefully. He published it at his own expense, and he campaigned with real persistence for legislative change. He was also, by various accounts, deeply paternalistic, moralistic in ways that irritated the workers he claimed to represent, and somewhat more interested in the spectacle of working-class suffering than in the workers' own capacity to organize on their behalf. He was, in other words, human, and his work contributed to the legislative changes that did eventually come, however slowly. The Gangs Act of 1867 and the Agricultural Children's Act of 1873 began to address the most visible abuses, particularly the employment of very young children in outdoor labor gangs. The Education Acts of the 1870s, by making school attendance compulsory, slowly reduced the supply of child labor to the brickyards, not because contractors suddenly discovered moral reservations, but because the children were increasingly required by law to be somewhere else during working hours. It is worth being precise about what changed and what did not. The very young children, the 5- and 6-year-olds on the tempering pits, the 7-year-olds turning bricks, these disappeared from the brickyards over the course of the 1870s and 80s. The debt system did not disappear. The piece rate structure did not disappear. The truck shop manipulation did not disappear. The physical demands on adult workers, the molders' backs, the drawers' eyes, the hack girls' feet, did not disappear. What improved was the most visible, most photographable, most morally legible element of the system. The underlying architecture of economic constraint continued for decades more. This is the point. Somewhere around the 1880s, when trade union organizing was beginning to reach even into the seasonal brick gangs, where our central mystery begins to resolve itself. Remember the question from the beginning. How does a trade practiced by free laborers across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations consistently end up producing bound workers? The answer is not that brick masters and contractors were uniquely evil. Some were. Many were merely indifferent, which in this context amounts to the same thing. But the structural answer is more precise than that. The brick trade operated in a condition economists call monopsony, a market structure where a single buyer, or a very small number of buyers in a given area, faces many sellers. In the brick fields, the brick master was effectively the only buyer of the local workers' labor. There was no alternative employer within walking distance. The workers could not travel to find better terms without money they did not have. They could not negotiate collectively without legal protection they did not possess. And the product they were making, bricks, was a commodity with thin profit margins that the brick master constantly sought to maintain by reducing labor costs. Into this structural situation, the debt system fit like a designed component, which, in some sense, it was. Not designed by a single mind, not organized by a conspiracy, but evolved over generations as contractors and brickmasters discovered what the workers could not resist. The advance, the truck shop, the tied housing, each element was individually defensible as a practical solution to a real logistical problem. Together, they constituted a mechanism of control that did not require chains, did not require guards, and left everyone, contractors, brick masters, and the legislators who looked the other way, free to say, with technical accuracy, that the workers were free to leave whenever they liked. They just could not afford to. And there, finally, is the answer to tonight's central question. It was not unique cruelty. It was geometry, the geometry of isolation and advance and debt, which reproduced itself wherever the conditions were right, because it was effective, and because the people it constrained rarely had the collective power to dismantle it until the 20th century finally provided the legal framework that made it possible. The pattern appeared in Mesopotamia because temple administrators discovered that workers issued rations in advance of labor production were effectively committed to completing that labor. It appeared in Victorian Britain because contractors discovered that workers' advanced travel costs were effectively committed to completing the season. It appeared in colonial South Asia, where we are headed next, because an almost identical system developed in the brick-making yards of Bengal and Bihar and the Punjab with a different name, different faces, and precisely the same underlying arithmetic. The brick itself travels across cultures and centuries, with barely a variation in its proportions. The system that produced it did the same. Chapter 7. The Bhatta System. Brickmaking in colonial South Asia. On a flat, sun-baked plain outside Lahore in the 1880s, a family of brickworkers was beginning a season that looked, in almost every administrative detail, identical to what was happening in the brick fields of Bedfordshire at the same moment. Different climate, different language, different clay, same ledger. The South Asian brick kiln system had a vocabulary of its own. The contractor was called the pathdar, or thekadar, the advance given to workers at the season's start, binding them to the kiln for the season, was called the peshgi. The kiln itself was called the Bhatta. The workers who molded bricks were the kumhars or patharas. The system of debt that held them in place was called bandhua mazdori, bonded labor. Different words, the same geometry. The peshgi was the pivot around which everything else turned. A migrant family arriving at a Bhatta in the Punjab or Bihar might receive a peshgi of 10 to 30 rupees, enough to cover their travel costs from the agricultural village where drought or debt had made farming impossible, and enough to purchase a few weeks of food while they established themselves. This sum was recorded in the pathdar's ledger. Against it, the family would earn their piece rate, a few annas per 1,000 molded bricks, and from it would be deducted their charges for the thatched hut they occupied on the kiln site, the water they used, the fuel for cooking, and any additional advances taken during the season when production fell short. The mathematics of the peshgi were, if anything, more rigorously punishing than their Victorian British equivalent, not because South Asian pathdars were more inventive in their cruelty, but because the structural conditions were starker. Agricultural workers arriving at the Bhatta had often already exhausted their alternatives. A failed monsoon, a local moneylender's demands, a caste restriction on the types of employment available. These had already removed most options before the peshgi was even offered. The brick kiln was, in many cases, the last employment standing between a family and starvation. And the pathdar knew this. Not necessarily with calculation, many operated with a kind of cheerful indifference to their workers' predicament that was, in its way, more chilling than active malice, but with the professional awareness of a man whose business model depended on a reliable, immobilized labor supply. Workers who could leave would leave when brick prices fell and piece rates dropped. Workers who owed the peshgi could not. The method of molding bricks in the Punjab was identical in principle to the Victorian British method, and the demands on the human body were identical in their severity, with the significant addition of the heat. A moulder working in the Punjabi hot season in May and June was moulding bricks in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, barefoot on clay ground that absorbed and radiated the sun's heat until it was painful to stand on. The clay dried faster in this heat, which was both an advantage and a complication. Faster drying meant more turns of the brick were needed, which meant more carrying for the women and children supporting the moulder, which meant the entire family's pace had to increase to keep up with the clay's behavior. And I use the word family deliberately because the Bhatta labor unit was almost universally the family, not the individual. Unlike the British brickyard, where workers were engaged somewhat individually, and women and children were legally separate from the men they worked alongside, the South Asian Bhatta system engaged entire family units as a single productive entity. The peshgi was extended to the family head, almost invariably the adult male, and the labor of his wife, his children, his elderly parents, if they were still able to work, was included in the calculation of what that family could produce against the debt. This made the family structure itself a mechanism of debt enforcement. The man could not redeem the peshgi through his labor alone, because the rate was set to require the family's combined output. The Indian colonial government was aware of the Bhatta system from at least the 1850s, when district collectors in the northwestern provinces began filing administrative reports noting the immobility of kiln laborers. These reports described, with the measured detachment of the colonial bureaucratic voice, a situation that their authors clearly recognized as problematic and just as clearly declined to address directly. The brick kilns were producing at that moment hundreds of millions of bricks annually for the construction of the colonial infrastructure, railways, cantonments, administrative buildings, irrigation works that was simultaneously the commercial justification for British presence in India and the physical embodiment of colonial power. Disrupting the labor system that produced those bricks was, in the colonial calculus, not a priority. There is a figure in the historical record from the 1890s that makes this colonial contradiction vivid in a single snapshot. A district collector in Bihar, a British official named Pemberton, whose reports survive in the India Office records in London, filed a detailed account of a Bhatta where workers had not left the kiln site in over 3 years. Their peshgi debt, through a combination of advancing, deducting, and recalculating at the pathdar's discretion, had grown rather than shrunk despite 3 full seasons of productive labor. Pemberton estimated that at the current rate structure, the debt would require approximately 7 more years of family labor to retire, assuming no further advances were taken and no deductions were added. He noted this. He recommended that magistrates be empowered to audit peshgi accounts. He submitted the report. The report was filed. 3 years later, Pemberton was transferred to a different district. The Bhatta continued to operate. This pattern of documentation without intervention, of colonial records that described the Bhatta system with clarity and changed almost nothing for decades, was not unique to Bihar. It repeated itself across the Punjab, Bengal, the Central Provinces, and the United Provinces throughout the second half of the 19th century and well into the 20th. But here is the part that demands honest reckoning. The Bhatta system and the Victorian British brickfield system were not simply parallel phenomena that happened to resemble each other. They were connected. British brickmasters and colonial administrators lived in a world where cheap brick, produced by constrained labor, was the foundation of an empire's physical infrastructure. The houses those officials retired to in Surrey and Berkshire were built from bricks, made in British fields by workers in the system described in Part 3 of tonight's story. The railway stations from which they departed for India were built from those same bricks, and the structures they built in India were made by workers in the Bhatta system that their own administrators documented and declined to disrupt. It was consistent, if nothing else. Chapter 8: The Long Shadow. Bonded labor in the 20th century and beyond. The 20th century began with a global wave of legislative reform that targeted bonded and forced labor with a directness the 19th century had never quite managed. And the brick kilns resisted it with a persistence that should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention. In India, the Workmen's Breach of Contract Act, which had criminalized workers' departure from contracted employment, was finally repealed in 1926. Removing the most egregious legal mechanism of Bhatta bondage. In Britain, successive truck acts and the growth of organized labor through the late Victorian and Edwardian periods had, by 1914, largely ended the worst contractor abuses in the brick fields. The legal architecture of coercion was being dismantled. The economic architecture, the isolation, the advance, the dependency, was proving more durable. Indian independence in 1947 did not end the Bhatta system. It reformed its legal framework, challenged its legitimacy in court, and gave workers a political vocabulary to describe their situation that colonial subjects had lacked. But the peshgi persisted. The family labor unit persisted. The tied housing persisted. The isolation of kiln sites from alternative employment persisted. What changed was the language used to discuss it and the formal illegality of its most explicit forms. What did not change, for several more decades in many regions, was the daily experience of the workers inside it. The Bonded Labor System, Abolition, Act of 1976, passed during Indira Gandhi's emergency period, which gives it a complicated political context all its own, formally abolished bonded labor in India in language of considerable clarity. Enforcement was another matter. A study conducted in Bihar in 1978, 2 years after the Act's passage, found brick kiln workers still bound by peshgi advances they could not repay, still living in tied housing on kiln sites, still unable to leave because the Pathdar held their debt. The investigators estimated that hundreds of thousands of workers across North India's Bhatta industry remained in effective bondage, a condition that was now illegal, had been illegal for 2 years, and continued with the quiet cooperation of local officials who found the brick kilns a useful source of inexpensive construction materials for government projects. The contemporary brick industry of South Asia is, by most estimates, the largest employer of bonded and debt-bound labor anywhere on Earth. Recent reports from organizations working on labor rights in India, Pakistan, and Nepal estimate that somewhere between 5 and 10 million people are currently working in brick kilns under debt conditions that substantially restrict their freedom to leave. The estimates vary widely because the nature of the system makes accurate counting difficult. The peshgi is rarely formalized in documents that outsiders can audit. The tied housing is presented as a benefit rather than a constraint, and the workers' own understanding of their situation ranges from clear-eyed awareness to a kind of habituated acceptance that has been present in every documented account of this system since the Sumerian ration tablets. Pakistan's Bhatta industry, which produces roughly 50 billion bricks per year, making it one of the largest brick producers in the world, was the subject of a landmark legal case in 1988. The Supreme Court of Pakistan, in a judgment that drew on Islamic law's prohibition of coercion as well as the country's constitution, ruled that the peshgi system as practiced in the brick kilns was unlawful. Employers were ordered to release workers from their debt obligations immediately. The judgment was celebrated. Its implementation was not immediate. Studies conducted in the 1990s found the system continuing with remarkably little modification. There is something that demands acknowledgement here. Before we move further, we have been discussing systems and structures and legislation and economic geometry, all of which is accurate and all of which carries the risk of making the experience abstract. So let us return briefly to the concrete. In 1995, a journalist named Jonathan Silvers spent several weeks documenting conditions in Pakistani brick kilns for an article published in the Atlantic Monthly. He described visiting a family, a man, his wife, and their 4 children, who had been working at a single Bhatta outside Lahore for 11 years. The original peshgi had been 12,000 rupees, taken when the father had needed money for his own father's funeral. 11 years of family labor, in conditions identical to those described in the Victorian parliamentary records, had reduced this debt to, by his account of the Pathdar's ledger, 11,800 rupees. In 11 years, the family had paid off 200 rupees of their 12,000 rupee debt. Those numbers, 12,000 rupees advanced, 200 rupees repaid in 11 years, are so perfectly representative of the structural mechanism that they might have been designed as an illustration of it. They were not designed. They emerged naturally from a system where the advance was large enough to require years to retire. The piece rate was set just below what the family's combined output could clear, and the deductions for housing, water, and occasional supplementary advances ensured that the gap between earning and owing never quite closed. 200 rupees in 11 years. The Sumerian administrator who set the ration quotas at Lagash in 2400 before the Common Era would have recognized the arithmetic immediately. Organizations working on Bhatta labor reform in India, Pakistan, and Nepal over the past 3 decades have documented both the system's extraordinary resilience and the genuine possibility of disrupting it when the combination of legal enforcement, alternative employment, and community support is sustained over long enough periods to break the specific mechanism of the peshgi. The difficulty is that each of these 3 elements requires sustained institutional will, which governments have provided intermittently and incompletely for reasons that blend genuine resource constraints with the brick industry's continued importance as a supplier of inexpensive building materials for public construction. The geometry of the conflict is similar to the one that confronted George Smith in 1870, and the parliamentary reformers in 1880, and the district collector Pemberton in 1893. The kilns are needed, the bricks are needed, and the workers who make them are, in the institutional accounting, a cost to be minimized rather than a population whose welfare is a primary concern. That has been slowly changing, and we will come to where things stand now. But first, because this story has been, by necessity, weighted heavily towards South Asia and Britain, and because the brick is genuinely ancient and genuinely global, we need to spend a chapter in a different part of the world entirely. Because some of the most remarkable brickmaking in human history happened not in the grey fields of Bedfordshire or the hot plains of the Punjab, but in the deserts of the ancient Americas. The Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, built in what is now central Mexico around the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, required approximately 1.2 million cubic meters of fill material. A significant portion of this fill, the internal structure that gives the pyramid its mass, was sun-dried adobe brick, not the fired brick of the Indus Valley or ancient Mesopotamia. Adobe clay mixed with straw or grass fiber, shaped in a mold or by hand, and dried in the fierce Mexican sun. The engineering principle was simple. The labor requirement was not. The adobe brick of Mesoamerica was both simpler and more demanding than its fired equivalent. Simpler because it required no kiln. The sun did the work that fire did elsewhere, and the Mexican plateau's dry season provided all the heat needed to cure a brick adequately for construction purposes. More demanding because adobe, unlike fired brick, had no permanent durability. A fired Sumerian brick could sit in a pit for 4,000 years and emerge structurally sound, as archaeologists have happily demonstrated. An adobe brick, if persistently wet, returns to clay. The great adobe structures of the pre-Columbian Americas were in a constant negotiation with the rain, maintained, replastered, and repaired by communities that understood their buildings were organic in a way that fired brick buildings were not. The tumplin, a carrying strap worn across the forehead to bear loads on the back, was the primary load-bearing technology of Mesoamerican construction. There were no wheeled vehicles. There were no draft animals suitable for heavy hauling. Everything that went into the Pyramid of the Sun, every adobe brick, every stone-facing block, every basket of earth fill, was carried up the construction ramp by a human being with a strap across their forehead. The tumplin distributes weight differently than a shoulder carry. It engages the neck muscles and the deep spinal extensors rather than the shoulders, and experienced carriers could move remarkably heavy loads over considerable distances with it. It also, over a lifetime of use, produces a characteristic compression of the cervical vertebrae that physical anthropologists can identify in skeletal remains. The people who built Teotihuacan left signatures in their own bones. 1,000 years after Teotihuacan, 1,000 miles to the north, the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest were doing something extraordinary with a similar material. The structures of Chaco Canyon in what is now New Mexico, built between roughly 900 and 1200 of the Common Era, used adobe mortar in combination with carefully shaped sandstone blocks to create multi-story apartment complexes housing hundreds of people, oriented with astronomical precision, connected by a road network built without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, and representing a level of community organization whose social structure we still only partially understand. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chacoan great houses, contained over 600 rooms arranged across multiple stories and was, at the time of its construction, one of the largest buildings in North America. Its walls show masonry of extraordinary precision, sandstone blocks shaped to fit courses of uniform height, bonded with adobe mortar mixed to a consistency that has held for 900 years in the canyon's arid climate. The workers who built it left no written records. The Chacoan system had no writing. But the precision of the construction implies a degree of craft knowledge transmission, the passing of specific skills from one generation to the next through practice and apprenticeship, that is as sophisticated as anything documented in the literate civilizations of the Old World. What the Chacoan builders achieved with their adobe and sandstone is a useful corrective to a particular assumption about the history of the brick. The assumption is that fired brick, the technologically advanced product of a kiln, represents progress over sun-dried adobe, just as industrially produced machine-made brick represents progress over hand-molded brick. This is an assumption that engineers and historians have found increasingly difficult to defend as they study how these different building traditions actually performed over time. Pueblo Bonito, built without a kiln, without fired brick, and without any of the industrial technology of the Mesopotamian or British traditions, is structurally sound after 900 years of desert freeze-thaw cycling. Some of the finest fired bricks produced by Victorian England's most advanced kilns have not performed comparably in the wet climate of the British Isles. The right material, correctly used, in the right climate. That is the principle that every brick tradition across every culture had to discover independently. We should spend at least a moment in the medieval Islamic world, because what Islamic brickmakers did with the fired brick between roughly the 9th and the 13th centuries represents a tradition of aesthetic sophistication that has no parallel anywhere in the history of the material. In Central Asia, in the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv, in Persia, in the Abbasid heartland of Iraq, brick was not merely a structural material. It was a decorative medium. Craftsmen discovered that by varying the orientation, projection, and spacing of individual bricks in a wall, they could create intricate geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity without any additional material, no tile, no plaster, no paint. The patterns emerged from the brick itself. From shadow and light falling across projected and recessed courses, from diagonal and herringbone orientations creating visual rhythm, from the careful alternation of stretcher and header faces producing optical effects that the medieval Islamic geometric tradition explored with mathematical intensity. The geometric brick decoration of medieval Central Asia was the work of specialists operating within a tradition as technically demanding as any craft of the period. A master decorator had to understand both the geometry, which was derived from the Islamic mathematical tradition and could involve patterns of extraordinary complexity based on subdivisions of the circle and the structural constraints of the wall, because the decorative brickwork had to maintain structural integrity while achieving its visual effects. These were not ornamental afterthoughts applied to a finished wall. They were integral to the wall's construction, planned from the foundation course upward, requiring the coordination of structural masons and decorative specialists working simultaneously. We do not know the names of the craftsmen who built the Kiln minaret in Bukhara, completed around 1027 of the Common Era. We know their work because it is still standing, and because it is astonishing. Those of you who have worked in the trades, masonry, bricklaying, any of the crafts where precision matters and where the work is meant to outlast you, will understand what it means to see work done at that level, in that period, with those tools. The quality of attention embedded in that minaret is something that transcends its era. Drop a comment if you've ever encountered craftsmanship like that in your own working life, work done with a standard that seems impossible given the conditions. I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Chapter 9. The Machine Age, when the hand left the brick. The mechanization of brick production came late relative to other industries, later than textiles, later than ironworking, later than glass manufacture, for the simple reason that the raw material, wet clay, resisted mechanical handling with considerable stubbornness. Clay is thixotropic. It behaves differently under pressure than it does at rest. It sticks to machinery in ways that jam moving parts, and its variable moisture content means that a machine calibrated for one batch of clay frequently performs badly on the next. The hand of the experienced molder, with its constant sensory feedback and instinctive adjustment, was in many respects more adaptable than any mechanism the early industrial age could devise. The breakthrough came, as industrial breakthroughs often do, from a specific combination of local geology and economic pressure. In the Fletton area of Bedfordshire, the lower Oxford clay, the geological stratum that had supplied the region's brickmakers for centuries, turned out to contain approximately 7% organic carbon distributed throughout the clay body. This meant that when Fletton clay was fired, the organic material burned internally, providing a significant portion of the fuel needed for the kiln from within the brick itself. The energy savings were dramatic. Fletton bricks could be fired at roughly half the fuel cost of bricks made from ordinary clays. Combined with the introduction of wire-cut extrusion machines that could produce 3 times the output of a skilled human molder, the Fletton process transformed the British brick industry in the 1890s with a speed that was, for the workers whose livelihoods depended on hand molding, thoroughly disorienting. The human cost of mechanization was distributed unevenly, as it always is. The skilled molders, men who had spent decades developing the specific physical capability and tactile intelligence that the wire-cut machine made irrelevant, found that their skill had no market beyond the small premium end of the trade, where handmade bricks were still valued for facing work. The hack girls and the brick turners were eliminated almost entirely from mechanized yards because the machine produced bricks of consistent dimension that required neither the human carrier nor the careful turning of the drying ground. Children disappeared from the workforce not only because legislation pushed them out, but because the mechanized process had no particular use for them. This is not an uncommon story in the history of industrialization. Those in tonight's audience who remember the post-war decades, who watched hand trades disappear in their own working lifetimes, who saw the thing that their parents had done well become a thing that a machine did adequately, will recognize the particular quality of that displacement. The work is gone. The skill is not transferable. The body that spent 30 years learning to do one specific thing precisely is suddenly worth rather less than it was yesterday. And yet the bricks kept getting made. By 1914, the Fletton district alone was producing nearly 2 billion bricks per year. 2 billion. From a handful of mechanized works employing a fraction of the workers that hand production had required. The Marston Valley and the surrounding Bedfordshire clay field had become, in the space of roughly 2 decades, the most productive brickmaking region in the history of the world to that point. And the bricks were being used with considerable urgency to build the housing, the infrastructure, and eventually the defensive installations of a country approaching the worst military conflict it had yet experienced. The timing is worth noting. The mechanization of the British brick industry reached full productive capacity just as the First World War created an enormous demand for a very specific kind of brick, the engineering brick, hard and impermeable, used for bunker construction, for the lining of gun emplacements, for the drainage systems of military camps. The Western Front was, among many other things, a massive brick engineering project. Those who know their family history from that period may know that some men from the brick-working districts were, in the early months of the war, retained in reserved occupations precisely because the kilns could not be allowed to go cold. We will come, shortly, to where the global brick industry stands in the 21st century, because the story does not end with the Hoffman kiln or the wire-cut machine or the First World War, and the workers who were described in the earlier parts of tonight's story are still, in their essential situation, recognizable in the contemporary brick fields of South and Southeast Asia. But before we get there, there is one more chapter that belongs in this story. Because the brick's history would be incomplete without at least a visit to the Roman brick, which is not quite what most people think it is, and which connects the industrial story we've been telling to a tradition of state organization that makes the Victorian contractor system look almost improvised by comparison. Chapter 10. The Roman Brick. Stamps, Slaves, and the State. The Roman brick is one of the most extensively documented building materials in the ancient world, and almost everything the popular imagination thinks it knows about it requires at least one significant qualification. First qualification: Roman bricks were not, for much of Roman history, what we would call bricks. They were large, flat tiles, tegulae bisales, roughly 2 Roman feet square and about 1.5 inches thick, used primarily as bonding courses in rubble concrete construction and as facing material, not as load-bearing masonry units in the sense that medieval or Victorian bricks were. The Romans built primarily in concrete, opus caementicium, and the brick was often a surface treatment, a regularizing layer, or a shuttering form for the concrete behind it. The structural engineering was in the concrete. The brick was, in a sense, the packaging. Second qualification: Roman bricks were stamped. Most ancient building materials are anonymous. We know they were made by someone, and that is essentially the limit of our knowledge. Roman bricks, particularly from the period of roughly the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era, frequently carry a stamped mark identifying the figlina, the brickworks, where they were produced, the name of the owner, sometimes the year of production, sometimes the name of the specific official who supervised that batch. These stamps are one of the great gifts that Roman administrative culture has given to archaeologists. They allow the construction dates of Roman buildings to be determined with reasonable precision. They allow the ownership and organization of Roman brick production to be traced across generations, and they reveal, among other things, a fact about the Roman brick industry that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The Roman brick industry, by the 2nd century of the Common Era, was substantially owned by the imperial family and the senatorial aristocracy. The figlinae, the brickworks of the Tiber Valley, were among the most profitable industrial enterprises in the ancient world, and the production stamps show that specific works were owned by emperors, by their wives, by their relatives, and by the wealthiest families of the Roman state. The Emperor Trajan's wife Plotina owned brickworks. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius owned brickworks. Hadrian reorganized the entire Tiber Valley brick industry under a more centralized imperial management structure, which is why the stamps from his reign are unusually consistent and well documented. What does this tell us? It tells us that in the most administratively sophisticated civilization of the ancient Western world, the production of bricks was not left to independent contractors and piece-rate workers. It was organized directly by the state, stamped with imperial authority, and distributed through a logistic system of considerable complexity. And the workers who produced those stamped bricks, some were slaves, the figline. Like most Roman industrial operations, used slave labor as a matter of course. Some were freedmen working under contractual arrangements. Some were free laborers paid daily or piece rates. The stamp recorded the works, the owner, and the year. It did not record the worker. The Roman administrative genius that produced such meticulous infrastructure documentation found the individual laborer no more worth noting than the Victorian brickmaster had found hack girls worth naming in his accounts. That consistency, across 2,000 years, is its own kind of historical commentary. The stamps do, however, preserve one category of name that would otherwise be entirely lost. Several stamped bricks from the Tiber Valley works carry the names of the dispensatores, the freedmen or slaves who served as on-site managers, responsible for the day-to-day supervision of production and the maintenance of quality standards. Men like Chryseros, whose stamp appears on bricks used in the construction of Hadrian's villa, like Primigenius, whose name marks bricks from the early 2nd century found in sites across Rome. They were not free men in any modern sense. They were property, or former property, operating within the most rigidly stratified social system of the ancient world. And their names are there, pressed into the clay, because someone in the 2nd century of the Common Era decided that accountability required documentation, and because fired brick is extraordinarily good at preserving impressions made in the moment before it hardened. The Roman hypocaust, the underfloor heating system that circulated hot air beneath the floors of bathhouses and wealthy homes, is perhaps the most elegant demonstration of what a standardized, quality-controlled brick could enable. The pile, the short columns of brick that supported the heated floor, had to be precisely enough made to bear the floor load evenly across the entire heated space. The tiles forming the floor above them had to be sufficiently flat and consistent in thickness to distribute that load without cracking. The flue tiles channeling hot air up the walls had to fit together tightly enough to prevent heat loss. The entire system worked at the tolerance of the individual brick, and the individual brick worked at the tolerance of the brickmaker who had molded it months or years earlier, whose name the stamp did not record. This is the final form of the observation that has been threading through tonight's story since the very first chapter. The brick enables. It enables the hypocaust, the sewer, the viaduct, the railway. It enables the city. It enables the civilization, and the people whose hands made it possible. Mary Ann Gaskin in the frozen Bedfordshire fields, the family outside Lahore with the unpayable peshgi, Thomas the kiln boy sleeping on his sacking, were, in the great institutional accounting of history, the invisible cost of the visible achievement. We're nearly at the end of tonight's journey, and the final chapter has something to say about where we are now, about whether the pattern has finally broken, or whether it persists in forms we simply haven't learned to see clearly yet. Chapter 11. The 21st Century Brick. What changed and what didn't. The 21st century global brick industry produces roughly 1.5 trillion bricks per year. 1.5 trillion. The number is essentially meaningless at the scale of a human imagination, so let us make it concrete in the way the brick itself is concrete. That is roughly 200 bricks for every person currently alive on Earth, produced in a single year, requiring the extraction of enormous quantities of agricultural topsoil, the combustion of vast amounts of coal and biomass fuel, and the labor of somewhere between 10 and 20 million workers worldwide, a significant proportion of whom remain in conditions recognizably descended from those documented in the Sumerian ration tablets and the Victorian parliamentary reports. China produces roughly 60% of the world's bricks, the majority of them through increasingly mechanized processes that have reduced the labor intensity of the industry substantially over the past 3 decades. Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal together account for most of the remainder. In these South and Southeast Asian industries, The mechanization process that transformed the British industry between 1880 and 1920 is currently underway, unevenly, partially, driven by the same combination of economic pressure and specific geological opportunity that drove it in Bedfordshire. And the social consequences are similarly uneven. In the regions where mechanization has advanced furthest, the most exploitative forms of the peshgi system have retreated. In the regions where hand production continues, which is most of the industry by volume, the system persists. The organizations working to disrupt the peshgi system, labor rights, NGOs, international bodies, a small number of progressive brick industry associations, have identified the same three leverage points that historical analysis would predict. Access to alternative credit that removes the necessity of the advance, legal enforcement robust enough to make debt bondage genuinely costly for pathdars, and alternative employment options that give workers a real choice. When all three are present and sustained, the system retreats. When one or more are absent, when the alternative credit dries up, when enforcement is inconsistent, when alternative employment is unavailable, the system re-establishes itself with the resilience of something that has been refining its adaptive mechanisms for 4,000 years. There is genuine reason for measured optimism on this front. Measured, because the history of this particular subject licenses optimism only with extreme caution. Sustained intervention programs in parts of India and Nepal have produced documented reductions in peshgi bondage over periods of 5 to 10 years. The growing mechanization of the South Asian industry, particularly in India, where the zigzag kiln technology, which dramatically reduces coal consumption and air pollution, has been adopted in several states, is creating economic pressure on the most labor-intensive production methods. The 2016 Brickfield Workers' Minimum Wage Act in Bangladesh was, by available accounts, imperfectly enforced but genuinely changed conditions in a measurable subset of the industry. Progress, in other words, is real. It is also slow, partial, and reversible in ways that 4,000 years of this system's history make depressingly clear. The cities of South Asia are growing at a rate that has no historical precedent in absolute terms. Dhaka, Karachi, Delhi, Kathmandu, each adding hundreds of thousands of residents per year, each requiring the construction of housing, infrastructure, and commercial buildings at a pace that the mechanized brick industries of Europe and North America would struggle to match even at full capacity. The hand-molded brick, produced by migrant family labor in rural Bhatta yards and transported to the construction sites of rapidly expanding cities, is not an anachronism. It is, in the current South Asian context, an economically rational response to a genuine need. The pathdar who perpetuates the peshgi system is not a villain from a previous century accidentally surviving into the present. He is a businessman operating rationally within a structure that makes the peshgi the most efficient way to assemble and retain a labor force in conditions of extreme rural poverty and absent formal credit. This does not make the system acceptable. It makes it understandable, and understanding it is the first requirement of changing it. There are, still, a handful of places in Britain where hand-molded bricks are made. Not many. A few small specialist works, producing bricks for the restoration of historic buildings that require materials matching the originals, the same dimensions, the same clay sources, the same hand-formed irregularity that machine-made bricks cannot replicate. The people who do this work are not bound laborers. They are skilled craftspeople, generally well paid by the standards of the construction industry, working in conditions that bear no resemblance to the Victorian brick fields. They are also, when you watch them, doing something that is recognizably the same physical act that a Sumerian worker performed at in 2100 before the Common Era. The clay goes in, the hands press, the brick comes out. Some things are simply themselves across all the centuries. That image, the hand impression in the clay, fired into permanence, is perhaps the single most appropriate image with which to approach the end of tonight's story. Because it contains everything. The human presence embedded in the material, the individual lost in the product, the specific person, their particular hand, their particular morning, their particular moment of pressing clay into a mold, preserved not as a name, not as a record, but as a physical trace. The brick carries them forward without crediting them. It always has. Chapter 12. What the bricks remember. A closing reflection. Every city built in the industrial era is a city built from people. Not metaphorically, literally. The bricks in the walls of Victorian terraced houses, of the sewers beneath London and Manchester and Birmingham, of the railway viaducts that still carry trains across the English countryside, were made by specific human beings whose bodies paid a specific price for that production. The woman who molded the brick in the wall outside your window had hands that ached every night and a back that bent before its time and a debt in a ledger that she may never have fully cleared. We do not know her name, but the brick is there, and it is not nothing. Historians of labor have a phrase, the hidden abode of production, borrowed from Marx, but used now across the discipline to describe the simple fact that the things we use and inhabit were made by people whose making of them is invisible in the finished product. The brick is one of the most extreme examples of this invisibility in all of human history, because brick is so thoroughly ubiquitous that we have ceased to see it at all. We see the building. We do not see the 4,000 years of specific human effort embedded in its walls. Tonight's story has been, in part, an attempt to make that invisible effort visible again, to follow the brick back to its origins in the clay and the human hands that shaped it, across civilizations and centuries and continents, and to sit for a while with the people whose names history did not think worth preserving. The Sumerian worker at the ziggurat of Ur assigned a quota of 300 bricks per day and given barley rations against that quota, would have recognized the essential situation of the Victorian hack girl working barefoot in the Bedfordshire fields without a moment's difficulty. The hack girl, if she could have seen the family in the Pakistani Bhatta of the 1990s and their unpayable peshgi, would have understood exactly what she was looking at. The continuity is not accidental, and it is not a failure of human moral imagination across the centuries. It is the persistent logic of a specific economic geometry, the geometry of isolated workers, advance wages, and a product that civilization requires but does not want to pay the full human cost of producing. The brick will outlast all of them. That is, in the end, the strange comfort and the strange cruelty of this trade. The brick is permanent in a way that the person who made it is not. The ziggurat survives, the Sumerian worker does not. The viaduct stands. The hack girl is unrecorded. The terraced house endures. The molder's bent back has long since returned to the same earth from which the clay was dug. The work persists. The worker does not. And yet, and this is the thing that seems important to say in the final minutes of a very long story, the work persists because the worker persisted, not abstractly, specifically. Mary Ann Gaskin, in the frozen field before 4 in the morning, with her infant at the edge of the clay and her bare hands pressing the 1,000th brick of a quota she would fill before dark. Thomas, 11 years old, sleeping on sacking beside a kiln whose heat was the closest thing to comfort available to him that night. The family outside Lahore, into their 12th year of a debt that had shrunk by 200 rupees. These people did not build civilization by accident, or by will, or by inspiration. They built it by showing up, in conditions that should not have been asked of any human being, and doing the work. If you live in a house built before 1950, if you have ever lived in one, if your parents did, if you have walked the streets of any British city or any South Asian city built in the colonial era, or any American city of the industrial period, then you have spent your life surrounded by the physical legacy of this trade. The walls have been there longer than you have. They will be there after you are gone. And inside them, pressed into the clay before it hardened, are the fingerprints of people who did not know you would one day live among their work, but who did the work anyway, as carefully as the conditions permitted, because that is what the human being does when there is nothing else available, the work in front of them, to the best standard they can manage, in the time they have. That is what the bricks remember, pressed into the clay 4,000 years before the words were there to say it. Every brick is a record of a specific human presence. Every wall is a census of people history declined to count. The brick trade is one of history's oldest. It gave us the city. It gave us the sewer and the aqueduct, and the railway and the terraced house where the lamp burns against the autumn dark. It cost, over its 4,000 years of practice, an amount of human labor and human suffering that no accounting has ever fully tallied, because the people who paid the cost were not the people who kept the books. Their work is still standing. Their names, mostly, are not. But the fingerprints are in the clay, if you know where to look. And in the quiet of all that history, the work they did still holds. If tonight's journey stirred something, if it brought back memories of your own working life, or your parents', or the trades and the labor you've known across the decades, I'd be genuinely honored if you shared those memories in the comments. Your generation holds a knowledge of what honest physical work costs the body and the spirit that doesn't make it into books. If you've worked in the building trades, in brickwork, in any of the heavy industries that built the world we live in, or if you heard stories from those who did, the comment section is yours, and I would very much like to read what you put there. Those of you who served, who worked the home front, who built or maintained or kept running the infrastructure that others took for granted, you understand better than most what it means to do invisible work that holds everything else up. This story was, in part, for you. The brick field at dusk. 5,000 bricks in a day. A life in the clay. A debt in a ledger. A fingerprint in the wall. Their struggles became our foundation. Their resilience, our inheritance. Now rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.